When I first arrived at the first motel along the interstate, I didn't think anything of it, but looking back, that was my first mistake. My name is Troy Whitaker, and at the time, I was traveling a lot for work. I always ended up staying at cheap, off-highway motels. Faded signs, doors that opened directly to the parking lot, and that lingering smell of old cigarette smoke. I was used to the quiet routine. I had just finished a long drive and pulled into a tired-looking motel in Ohio. The sun was already down, and the parking lot was mostly empty, just a few scattered cars reflecting the buzzing neon sign from the front office. I checked in, got my key card, and drove around back. I parked my gray sedan, grabbed my bag, and locked the doors. That was when I first noticed the truck. It was parked 2 spaces down from my car. It was an older model pickup, probably from the late 90s. The paint was a dull, faded blue, peeling heavily near the edges of the hood. The wheel wells were completely rusted out, and there was a very distinct, deep dent on the left side of the rear bumper. There was also a faded yellow sticker stuck to the lower left corner of the back window. It was just a beat-up old truck. I didn't give it a second thought. I went into my room, ordered some food, and went to sleep. The next morning, I woke up early. The blue truck was gone. I hit the road, grabbed a coffee at a drive-thru, and started my next long stretch of driving. My next stop was a town over 200 miles away in Indiana. The drive was completely uneventful, just endless miles of flat highway, passing semi-trucks and rundown billboards. By the time I reached my destination, it was a little past 7 p.m. This second motel had the same basic layout. I checked in, got my room on the second floor, and parked my car. I carried my bags up the metal stairs, went into my room, and dropped my stuff. I was exhausted. I walked over to the window to pull the curtain shut for the night. I looked down at the parking lot. My stomach dropped. Parked directly under a street lamp was an old, faded blue pickup truck. I stared at it. The lot was full, but the truck stood out perfectly under the bright yellow light. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Lots of people drive old trucks. It is a major interstate after all. People travel the same routes all the time. But as I kept looking, I focused on the details, the rust around the wheel wells, the deep dent on the rear bumper, the faded yellow sticker on the back window. It was the exact same truck. I felt uneasy. It makes sense to see the same vehicle on the highway, but to pull off, navigate through a different town, and park at the exact same motel over 200 miles away, something felt off. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were just a traveling worker on a budget like me. I deadbolted my door and tried to ignore the feeling in my gut. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I heard a car drive past, I would wake up and listen. The next day, I was out the door by 5:30 a.m. I didn't even look toward the spot where the truck had been parked. I had a lot of ground to cover, heading toward my final stop in Illinois. The whole time I was driving, I kept checking my rearview mirror. Every time I saw a blue vehicle in the distance, I would tense up until it passed me and I saw it was just a minivan or a normal sedan. By the afternoon, I started feeling a little silly. I convinced myself I was overreacting to a completely random coincidence. I arrived at the third motel around 8 p.m. It had started raining heavily and the sky was dark. This motel was tucked away behind a large gas station. I was tired and hungry. I went inside the lobby, got my room key, and the front desk clerk told me to park around the right side of the building. I drove around the corner. The rain was coming down hard. I found a parking spot near my door in the mostly empty lot. I turned off my engine and sat in the quiet car for a moment, listening to the rain. Just as I reached for my door handle, I saw headlights sweep across the brick wall in front of me. Another vehicle turned directly toward my row of parking spots. It pulled into the empty space immediately to my left. It parked directly beside my car. The engine cut off and the headlights went dark. Through my rain-streaked window, I looked at the vehicle. It was the faded blue pickup truck. The rust, the dent, the sticker. It was less than 2 feet away from me. I froze. I didn't move a muscle. I just sat staring straight ahead. I was waiting to hear a car door open or see someone step out into the rain. But nothing happened. The truck just sat there, dark and silent. The tinted windows made it impossible to see inside. Whoever was in there was just sitting in the dark, right next to me, completely still. Panic pushed me into motion. I grabbed my bag, opened my door quietly, and stepped out into the rain. I kept my head down, walked quickly to my room, swiped the key card, and shoved the door open. I slipped inside, locked the deadbolt, and hooked the security chain. I walked over to the window, keeping the lights off. I pulled back the curtain just enough to see out. The blue truck was still sitting there. No one had gotten out. I stood watching for nearly 20 minutes. Nothing. Eventually, I stepped away from the window and sat on the edge of the bed. I kept my phone in my hand, thinking about calling the police. But what would I tell them? They hadn't threatened me or spoken to me. They hadn't even gotten out. I decided to wait it out. About an hour later, the rain started to slow down. That was when I heard it. From outside, I heard a slow, heavy sound. It sounded like boots walking on the wet concrete walkway. The footsteps were coming from the parking lot, moving closer. I held my breath. The footsteps grew louder, step by step, getting closer to my room. I moved quietly to the door and pressed my eye against the peephole. The view was distorted, showing the concrete walkway. The footsteps dropped right outside my door. A dark figure stepped into the frame. It was a man wearing a dark jacket with the hood pulled up. He was standing perfectly still, facing my door. He didn't knock, he just stood there. I didn't make a sound. We stayed like that for what felt like hours until he finally turned around and walked away. I watched through the peephole until he was out of sight. A few moments later, I heard an engine start up. I went back to the window. The blue truck was backing out. It turned around and drove out of the lot, disappearing into the dark. I didn't sleep a single minute that night. I sat waiting for the sun to come up. As soon as there was light, I packed my things and left the room. I walked out to my car. The lot was empty. The truck was truly gone. I opened my car door and threw my bag onto the passenger seat. As I walked around to the driver's side, something caught my eye. Pinned firmly under my windshield wiper was a small piece of paper. It was soaked from the rain. I carefully unfolded it. The ink was slightly smeared, but I could still read the printed text. It was a diner receipt. I looked at the address printed on the top. It was from a small local restaurant in the exact same town as the very first motel I had stayed at 3 days ago. On the back of the damp paper, there was a dark, greasy thumbprint. They hadn't just happened to be driving the same way. They had been with me since the very first night, following my every move across 3 states. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove away as fast as I could without looking back. Have you ever noticed the same car following you for a little too long? I remember that night clearly because nothing unusual was supposed to happen at a roadside motel in Nevada, but it did. My name is Brendan Kessler. A few years ago, I was making a long, exhausting drive across the state line. I had been on the road for over 12 hours. My eyes were heavy, and the dark desert highway was starting to blur together. I wasn't planning on stopping, but I knew if I kept driving, I was going to fall asleep at the wheel. I pulled off at the next exit. There wasn't much around, just a gas station that was closed for the night, and a single, one-story motel. It was one of those old places with doors that face right out into the parking lot. The neon sign out front was buzzing, half of the letters burned out. I went into the tiny lobby and paid in cash. The guy at the desk didn't say much. He just slid a physical metal key across the counter and told me my room was down at the far end of the building. I drove my car over and parked right in front of my door. The lot was quiet. There were only 3 or 4 other cars parked along the entire strip. I grabbed my duffel bag from the passenger seat, unlocked the door to my room, and stepped inside. The room was exactly what you would expect for $40 a night. Faded patterned carpet, a heavy tube TV sitting on a wooden dresser, and a bed with a thin, scratchy blanket. The air conditioner under the window was rattling, blowing stale, cold air into the room. I was too tired to care about how it looked. I just wanted to sleep. I dropped my bag on the floor and walked over to the window to shut the curtains. They were those thick, heavy blackout curtains on a sliding metal track. I grabbed the edges and pulled them together to block out the harsh yellow light from the parking lot, but they wouldn't close. The track was slightly bent in the middle, keeping the 2 heavy panels from overlapping. No matter how hard I pulled, there was always a thin gap, maybe 2 or 3 inches wide. right down the center. I tried using the side of my heavy duffel bag to pin one side of the fabric down, but the stiff material just slid right back along the metal rail, opening the gap again. It left a perfect, vertical slice of the parking lot visible from the bed. I could see the concrete walkway, a couple of parked cars, and a glowing ice machine across the lot. I felt a little annoyed, but I was exhausted. I figured since the room was going to be completely dark, no one would be able to see inside anyway. I turned off the overhead light, lay down on the mattress, and almost immediately fell asleep. Around midnight, I woke up. My throat was dry from the rattling air conditioner. I rolled over to check the time on my phone. The room was pitch black, except for that vertical beam of yellow light cutting through the gap in the curtains and stretching across the carpet. I grabbed my water bottle from the nightstand. As I took a drink, I looked toward the window. Through that narrow slit, I could see the glowing ice machine across the parking lot, and standing right in front of it was a person. It was just a dark silhouette against the bright vending light. They weren't moving. They weren't reaching for ice or putting quarters into the machine. They were just standing perfectly still, facing the direction of my room. Something felt off. It was a strange time to just be standing outside in the desert heat, but I tried to be rational. I told myself it was probably just another guest taking a walk, or maybe someone out there smoking a cigarette where they weren't supposed to. I watched the dark figure for a few minutes, waiting for them to walk away, but they just stayed planted there. Eventually, I laid back down. I turned my back to the window and managed to fall asleep again. When I woke up the second time, the room felt different. It was much colder and the air conditioner had kicked off, leaving the room completely silent. I checked my phone. It was almost 2 a.m. I rolled over and looked at the gap in the curtains again. The ice machine was empty. But as I shifted my focus to the parking lot, my stomach dropped. The person wasn't by the ice machine anymore. They were standing between two parked cars, much closer to my room. Through the 2-inch gap, I could clearly see the shape of a tall man wearing a dark jacket. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets. But what made me freeze was the angle of his head. He wasn't just looking at the building. He was looking directly at my window. I felt uneasy. The parking lot was dead quiet. There was no reason for anyone to be standing between cars at 2 in the morning, staring at a dark motel room. I stayed completely still on the bed. I didn't want to sit up or move closer to the window. If I moved, he might see my shadow shift in the dark. I just laid there, watching him through the gap. He stood there for a long time. Minutes dragged by. He didn't check his phone. He didn't smoke. He didn't shift his weight. He just stood like a statue, staring straight at the thin sliver of glass. I started thinking about calling the front desk, but then I remembered the sign in the lobby. The office closed at midnight. I was entirely on my own out here. I kept my eyes locked on the figure until my vision started to blur. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he slowly turned around and walked out of the narrow field of view the gap provided. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I stayed awake for another hour, listening for any sounds outside my door. No footsteps, no engines starting, just the quiet hum of the desert wind. Exhaustion eventually took over again, and my eyes forced themselves shut. I don't know exactly what time I woke up next. It was still dark outside, maybe around 4:30 a.m. I woke up with a sudden jolt, like my body knew something was wrong before my brain did. I looked straight at the window. The yellow light from the parking lot was gone. The gap in the curtains was completely blacked out. Something wide and dark was blocking the entire bottom half of the opening. I stared at the dark mass, my mind trying to make sense of what I was looking at. The room was incredibly quiet. Then, the dark shape shifted slightly. It was a head. Someone was standing immediately outside my window. They were pressed right up against the glass, peering directly through that 2-inch gap into my room. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. They were less than a few feet away from me, separated only by a thin pane of cheap glass. I didn't know how long they had been standing there, watching me sleep in the dark. Then, I heard a faint, slow sliding noise. It sounded like skin rubbing against glass. I watched in horror as the dark shape shifted higher. They were resting their hand and their face against the window, trying to look past the heavy fabric of the curtain, trying to get a better angle to see the bed. My heart was hammering in my chest. I knew I had to do something. If I yelled, they would know exactly where I was in the room. I slowly reached my hand out, blindly feeling across the nightstand until my fingers brushed against my phone. I gripped it tight. I pressed the power button to light up the screen. The sudden burst of white light illuminated my face and the bed for a split second. The shadow at the window instantly flinched back. The dark mass vanished from the gap, and the bright yellow light from the parking lot flooded back into the room. I jumped out of bed. I didn't bother packing neatly. I grabbed my duffel bag, threw my clothes and charger inside, and shoved my feet into my shoes. I did it all in the dark, my eyes darting between the gap in the curtains and the locked door. I grabbed my car keys off the dresser. I stood by the door for a few seconds, holding my breath, listening. I didn't hear anything outside. I unlocked the deadbolt, pulled the handle, and practically ran out into the humid night air. I threw my bag into the back seat of my car and jumped into the driver's side. I hit the lock button immediately. I looked around the parking lot. The cars were still there. The ice machine was still glowing. But the lot was completely empty. There was no sign of the man in the dark jacket. I shoved the key into the ignition and started the engine. The headlights washed over the brick wall of the motel. Before I put the car in reverse, I glanced back at my room. The curtains were still open just a crack, exactly the way I had left them. The harsh overhead light of the parking lot was hitting the glass perfectly. And there, right in the center of the window pane, directly in line with where my head had been resting on the pillow, was a clear, fresh, greasy handprint. I slammed the car into reverse, backed out of the space, and sped out of the parking lot. I merged onto the dark highway and didn't stop driving until the sun came up. Have you ever wondered who might be looking back when you look out your window at night? I was alone at a quiet roadside motel off the interstate, which wasn't unusual, but something about that night just felt different. My name is Callum Rhodes. A couple of years ago, I was moving across the country for a new job. I had packed everything I owned into my dark blue Honda Civic and hit the road. I planned to do the long drive in 3 days, which meant spending many exhausting hours on the highway. On the second day, I got a late start. By the time the sun went down, I still had a few hundred miles to go before I reached my planned stopping point. Around 7:30 p.m., I started getting hungry. I was driving through a very rural stretch of the state, and there weren't many options around. I finally saw a faded, glowing billboard for a place called the Copper Kettle Diner. I took the exit and pulled into the gravel parking lot. There were only a couple of other cars there. I went inside, sat in a booth near the window, and ordered a burger. I remember looking out the window at the dark parking lot while I ate. It was incredibly quiet. After paying my bill, I got back in my car and continued my drive. By 10:30 p.m., my gas gauge was getting low. I took another exit that had a sign for a 24-hour gas station. It was an older, rundown station with just 4 pumps. 3 of them had yellow out-of-order bags covering the nozzles. I pulled up to the only working one, pump number 4. While the tank was filling, I stood outside in the cold air. A dark SUV pulled into the lot and parked near the side of the convenience store building. The headlights turned off, but no one got out. I didn't think much of it. People sleep in their cars on road trips all the time. I finished pumping my gas, got back in, and merged back onto the highway. Shortly after 1 a.m., I was fighting to keep my eyes open. I knew it wasn't safe to keep driving, so I decided to stop at the next place I saw. About 20 minutes later, a glowing neon sign appeared in the distance. It was a standard, 1-story roadside motel with exterior doors facing the parking lot. I pulled into the office area. The lobby was tiny and smelled strongly of cheap air freshener. The guy behind the counter looked like he had been asleep. I paid for one night, and he handed me a real metal key attached to a plastic tag. Room 114. I drove my car around to the side of the building. The lot was very dimly lit, with only a few overhead street lamps casting dull yellow light across the asphalt. I parked directly in front of my room. I grabbed my overnight bag from the passenger seat, unlocked the heavy wooden door, and stepped inside. The room was basic. A bed with a thin floral bedspread, a small TV on a wooden dresser, and a nightstand between the bed and the window. I locked the door behind me, making sure to latch the security chain. I threw my bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the mattress. I was exhausted, but my mind was still racing from the hours of highway driving. I figured I would turn on the TV for a little while to help me wind down. I didn't see the remote on top of the dresser, so I reached over and opened the drawer of the nightstand. There was no remote inside. Instead, there was a thick black leather binder. It looked like one of those guest directories that usually have local delivery menus and motel rules inside. I pulled it out and opened it just out of mild curiosity. It wasn't a normal directory. The pages inside were filled with handwritten notes. It seemed like previous guests had been using it as a journal to leave reviews and recommendations for whoever stayed in the room next. Most of the entries were pretty standard. Things like complaining about the water pressure or saying the beds were uncomfortable. I started flipping through the pages, casually reading the different handwriting. Then, one entry near the middle of the book caught my attention. It was written in blue pen. It said, "If you were passing through, make sure to get a burger at the Copper Kettle Diner." I paused. I stared at the page. Out of all the places to eat, they mentioned the exact same diner I had stopped at earlier that evening. I told myself it was just a strange coincidence. The diner was right off the highway, so it made sense that other travelers had eaten there too. I brushed it off and turned the page. A few pages later, another entry stood out. This one was written in black marker. It said, "The gas station at exit 48 is the only one open late. Make sure you use pump number 4. My stomach dropped. I had stopped at exit 48. I had used pump number 4. I felt uneasy. One coincidence was easy to ignore, but two felt completely wrong. It felt too specific. I looked closely at the handwriting. There were no dates written next to any of the entries. I started flipping through the remaining pages faster. My heart started beating a little heavier against my ribs. I wanted to prove to myself that this was just a weird book full of random local tips. I reached the very last page that had writing on it. It wasn't a full paragraph like the others. It was just 2 short sentences, written in thick black ink right in the center of the white page. Room 1114. Dark blue Honda. I stopped breathing. That was my room number. That was my exact car. I dragged my index finger across the words. The thick black ink smeared instantly across my skin. It was completely fresh. Someone had just written this. My mind started spinning. Whoever wrote this had been at the diner. They had been at the gas station. They had followed me here. And worst of all, they had been inside this room mere minutes before I checked in. Or, even more terrifying, they worked here and gave me this specific room on purpose. I stood up from the bed slowly, trying not to make any sudden noises. I looked around the room. The bathroom door was closed. The closet was just an open alcove with a few empty hangers. I was alone in the main area, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Then, I heard a sound. It came from outside the room. I heard a sound. It came from outside the room. They heard a soft break, wike. It sounded like slow footsteps moving toward my door. I froze completely. The footsteps stopped right outside my room. I stared at the heavy wooden door. Underneath the door frame, a shadow blocked out the thin strip of yellow light from the parking lot. Someone was standing right on the other side. I didn't make a sound. I waited for a knock, or for them to say something, but it was just completely silent. Then, I saw the brass doorknob slowly start to turn. It twisted to the right, stopping when it hit the locking mechanism. There was a long pause. Then, it twisted to the left, shaking slightly as whoever was outside tried to force it open. The deadbolt held firm. Panic pushed me to move. I reached down and grabbed my overnight bag off the floor. I slung it over my shoulder and kept my eyes glued to the door. The handle stopped moving. The shadow underneath the door lingered for another agonizing 10 seconds before slowly shifting away. I heard the soft footsteps walking away down the concrete path, heading toward the back of the building. I didn't wait to see if they were coming back. I grabbed my car keys, stepped up to the door and looked through the peephole. The walkway was empty. I unlatched the chain, unlocked the deadbolt, and threw the door open. I sprinted the 5 feet to my car, practically throwing myself into the driver's seat. I slammed the door shut and hit the lock button immediately. I jammed the key into the ignition and started the engine. As my headlights flicked on, they illuminated the dark edge of the parking lot near the dumpsters. Standing just at the edge of the light, I saw the silhouette of a person. They were standing perfectly still, watching my car. I threw the car into reverse, backed out recklessly, and slammed on the gas. I sped out of the parking lot and merged back onto the highway, going well over the speed limit. I drove for over 4 hours until the sun finally came up, constantly checking my rearview mirror to make sure no one was behind me. I never found out who was writing in that book or why they had targeted me. I just know that if I hadn't checked that drawer, I might not have realized I was being hunted until they found a way inside. When you travel alone, do you ever check the drawers in your room before going to sleep?